So I've got to be honest, all of this talk, this conceptualizing talking that we're doing and this discussion is really confusing me because it's hard to make sure that I'm on the same level or I'm using the words in the same way that everybody else is using them, especially in this conversation in the comments of my video about my paper. Me and Nick, or Nick and I, to be grammatically correct, are having this discussion about what the basic units of consciousness are. And there's a lot of ways to approach that problem. From a neurological standpoint, we could say, well, obviously the units of consciousness are neurons, and they're basically on-off switches. Or we could think of them as chairs that fold open and down, stadium chairs, like you were saying the other day, Nick. And so from a physical perspective, a neurological perspective, the basic units are neurons. From a more conceptual perspective or mental perspective, from the perspective of mind, which is sort of an ontologically different category than the perspective that we're looking at of the body, which makes neurons the basic units. And the reason we can shift to these two different ontological domains, mind or body, neurons or words, which I would say are the units of the mental realm or perspective, is because of this dualism that we're trying to overcome between mind and matter. And that's why it's so confusing to talk about these issues, because there is so much confusion because of this dualism, because we have these two irreconcilable domains, the mental domain and the physical domain, that just don't go together. And language is supposed to be the bridge between the two, right? But it isn't necessarily that way. A lot of the philosophy of language that thinkers like Wittgenstein and Heidegger have been working on the last century has shown that language exists on its own level. Heidegger said it's the house of being, and Wittgenstein talked about language games and how language isn't always, a word isn't always just a symbolic representation of an object in the world. That's not how language works. It can work like that sometimes if we choose to play that language game, but we can also play more abstract language games where the words we use don't represent anything. Their meaning comes from their use, from the context within which they are employed. And when we look at language that way, mind, instead of being something that reflects the world, turns into something that relates to the world. And language becomes more of this this different level of this different world. It's almost its own world, all on its own. And it's a world where traditionally I exist, and you exist, and they exist, and it exists, and all these grammatical constructs that we then go about trying to apply to the world itself, and we're constantly failing at that, or we succeed temporarily until someone says, oh, I found a crack in your construct, your structure of words that doesn't line up to the world itself, and so we have to scrap that and start over, and that's constantly happening. That's how science shifts paradigms, and so we seem to be forced to deal with this issue of language never being fully able to encompass or describe the essence of the world. And I should even say describe the essence, because you're not describing when you talk about essences. You're saying this is what it is. You're not beating around the bush. You're not talking about it. You're not making metaphors to say what it's like. You're actually giving the essence, the isness of it. So we don't describe essences, and that's the problem. We've always been searching for essences. Thought wants to know what something is in itself. And I think Nick's question, what are the basic units of consciousness? The basic units of mind and thinking. What is a thought? We're trying to find the essence of something. And I can't really offer an answer to that question, because the essence is this, an essence is something created by language that doesn't necessarily exist in the world itself, because this world is not constant or stable. It's in time. It's becoming, and to search for being. What? Sorry about that. To search for being is sort of that's what happens after we start becoming language virtuosos, and we start to think that we could actually think meaning language, or use words to conceptualize. We think we can actually find being in the world, and the whole problem of what is being sort of is created by language. It's a problem inherent to language. But before language, there is no separation between existence and being, or reality and ideality, or there's no dualism there. So there's no problem. And to try to answer this question, what are thoughts? One of my philosophy professors, Dr. Mason Cash, is really into the idea of normativity and intersubjectivity. And his idea is that there are no thoughts, there are only oughts. And so in other words, we are normatized and socialized by a group, by a community. And what we think, the words that we use, are sort of given to us by that community. And so we think what we ought to think based on our memory of how others have spoken to us, and how the words that we have used have influenced others. And so it's not so much what we think or what we thought, but what we ought. And it makes these thoughts, instead of being in this separate mental realm, they start to be more oriented towards action, because I ought to think this way, because the reaction that will occur in the world when I think that way is what's significant, rather than just the thought itself, just the concept itself. And I think that's definitely, it's a good direction to move in, I think. But as far as the units of consciousness are words if we're talking about the mind. If we're talking about the brain, the units of consciousness are neurons. So hopefully something got cleared up here. I mean, I'm just basically thinking out loud. I don't even know exactly what I'm saying. Hopefully some sense was made, and we can move on to the next step. So thanks for listening.